This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
And emotion with some connections to social psychology and clinical psychology. I call my lab the Motivated Attention and Perception Lab. And we're grounded in techniques that you might be familiar with from the attention and perception literature, if any of you are attention researchers. If you are, then these will immediately have meaning to these pictures here. And the idea that within the visual cognition literature, we don't think of attention as being some monolithic construct, but a series of discrete, dissociable mechanisms. But I combine that with a long-standing interest of mine in the role that motivation and emotion play in shaping our very perceptions of the world, our visual reality. And I think of these often as motivation being sort of explicit motivations, so what are our goals and what are the things that we're trying to do, and emotion, as you can think of as sort of implicit motivation. It's those states that drive us towards or away from something, regardless of whether we do so strategically. So that's why I come to call my lab the Motivated Attention Perception Lab. And our research program covers a broad range of things. So we look at fundamental links between attention and perception, such as in the phenomenon of inattentional blindness. We look at the role of stress on cognition. And we've induced stress in a number of ways. Physiological stress through exercise or immersion of your arm in an ice bucket. Threat of shock, which is always a fun one. And we recently have done some neat forays into inducing stress through virtual reality, basically taking people with fear of heights and putting goggles on them and dangling them at 80 meters high in a skyline, which has got some neat effects. Through some collaborations, we're looking at how we learn to associate things out there in environment with positive or negative value and how that shapes our attention. Looking at emotion regulation, and then often trying to take some of these insights that we get and trying to apply them to real-world problems like driving safety. So it's kind of a broad research program, but at its heart, they all converge on this central topic of attention and emotion, which has been a long-standing interest of mine. And so one thing we know about emotional stimuli is that they capture attention and they linger in memory more than non-emotional stimuli do. And years of excellent research, decades of research, have sort of helped us understand the mechanisms by which they do so. But it's not just a theoretically interesting question about how does emotion shape where we pay attention. It's also a question that has some clinical implications. So, for example, disorders such as anxiety and depression often characterized by exaggerated tendencies to pay attention to threatening stimuli in the environment. And to such a degree that some have suggested that these attentional biases, you might call them, play a role in sort of maintaining or playing into and exacerbating the anxiety and depression that people already have. Now there's some gold standard tasks that people have used in this literature, in the attention and emotion literature. And there's such a gold standard that it often is the case that whole corners of the field are founded on this single task. So for example, the most widely used task to look at attentional biases, emotion-driven attentional biases, is known as the dot probe. So that's something like this. So imagine that you're looking for a target that's going to appear in one of these two locations, and you have to respond to it as quickly as you can. Let's say it's an asterisk that appears in one of those two locations. But just before the target appears, those two locations are occupied by an emotionally powerful image, a threatening image, and a neutral image. And the typical finding is that people are faster to respond to the target when it appears at the location of that threatening image than when it appears at the opposite location. Presumably because that threatening image grabs attention to that location, and then if the target appears in the opposite location, then you need to take that extra time to reorient your attention to that location. So that makes sense? So it's this difference in response time that's often taken to infer that people have an attentional bias to attend to the location of that threatening stimulus. Now that's very explicitly a measure of what we call spatial attention. The idea that what we pay attention to is driven by what you might liken to a spotlight in space. You pay attention to the tree, and then that representation of the tree dominates your perceptual reality. But if you shift attention to the threatening stimulus like a funnel web spider, that's what dominates. And you might even be slower to disengage from that threatening stimulus. And like I said, that's something that's referred to as spatial attention. But if you come from the visual cognition literature, then you already know that, well, if you consider the gamut of attention mechanisms that we can rely on, spatial attention is just one tile in that large mosaic of attentional phenomena. One of the reasons people have been so interested in these attentional biases, and one of the reasons that they think it might play a role in anxiety and depression, is because to a large degree they might help shape our perceptual reality. If you have anxiety and you have a tendency to just automatically orient attention to threatening stimuli in the environment, well, that's sort of like a feedback loop. All of a sudden, that's sort of the world provides confirming evidence that it's an anxiety-producing threatening place, right? Does that make sense? But it turns out that you can find lots of instances in the literature where you can find a dissociation between an index that suggests that you move spatial attention to a location and your ability to become aware of what's there. You can often find indices that suggest someone shifted attention to a particular location, even if they can't report what was there. And so if you're interested in developing an understanding of how attention shapes our perceptual reality, then maybe these spatial attention measures, which rely on response time differences, aren't necessarily the best way to understand how emotion might shape what we become aware of, or shape what we see. So a task that my colleagues and I have developed, which more directly probes visual awareness and how it's impacted by emotional stimuli, is something that we call the emotion-induced blindness task. And so that takes the form of a rapid serial visual presentation of items flashing on the screen at a rapid rate, about 10 per second. And they're all upright landscape and architectural photos, except for one target, which is a rotated scene. Rotate 90 degrees to the right, like this one, or 90 degrees to the left. And then in the trial, people just report which way was that target rotated. And people are pretty good at this task, even though everything's going by at a very fast rate. The twist is that also in the stream, sometimes we embed a distractor that is emotionally neutral, just like another person, a person in the stream, or emotionally evocative, like that. I should point out that that's me, right there. This was from the first paper that we published in 2005. And the night before I went to press, I realized that you weren't really supposed to. We had originally, the figure involved one of the samples from the International Affective Picture System, one of the most widely used databases of emotional images. And I learned the night before that you're really not supposed to publish them because it compromises their usefulness as a research tool. And so I panicked and ran home, grabbed a digital camera and a kitchen knife, ran to a 24-hour chemist, got some pantyhose to put over my head, and I'm actually not sure who that is. In all my papers now. Actually, no. She's actually now a professor at Ohio State. So, for some reason, she decided to pursue a career in psychology. This is a schematic of what that task looks like. You can see there's the target right there, and 2 items before it, there's that emotional image. But I'll show you what it looked like from a participant's perspective. What we're going to see here is a rapid stream of stimuli, all upright landscape and architectural photos. But see if you can find that one target that's rotating 90 degrees so the top is facing to the right, or 90 degrees to the left. And I'll ask you to call out which way you saw it rotated. Ready? Go. Okay, did you see it? Which way was it rotated? Sorry? Okay, it was actually rotated 90 degrees, top facing to the right. But although most of you didn't see it, did you all see the snake? Yeah. Okay, so that kind of stands out as sort of a threatening type of stimulus. And in the lab, it turns out that a lot of people experience what you experience. So lag 8 refers to what happens when the target is the 8th item in that stream after that distractor. So 800 milliseconds, almost a full second, have had a chance to pass. And people are pretty good at reporting it, regardless of whether the distractor that came before is emotionally neutral or is threatening, or is negative. The question is, what happens when it appears closer in time, that distractor? And there you get a very robust difference. So all of a sudden, it's as if that processing that emotional image sort of hijacks your perceptual system and impairs your ability to see the one target that you look for. Right? It's the only target you look for. And unlike, note that this is not a measure of spatial attention. It's not about whether you shift attention left or right or up or down, because you're always looking in the same place. And so it's engaging attention and your perceptual system in a very different way than the dot probe is. And so, this is some of the things. I'm giving away a little bit of my talk here in terms of the conclusions that I'm going to share with you. But first thing is that it's a robust effect. We never don't get emotion-induced blindness, as long as the images that you're using are emotionally strong enough. And what I'm going to suggest is that it appears to reflect relatively unique mechanisms in the context of the broader literature. And it's that mechanistic uniqueness that's one of the reasons why I personally have been so fascinated with this phenomenon for so long, just trying to disentangle what is going on here. And for those of you who are interested in individual differences and its potential clinical implications, it is something that does appear to be sensitive to individual differences, and it is resistant to things like attentional control, which helps set it apart from the dot probe as well, which has been suggested to be influenced by attentional control. So first let me sort of explain what I think is going on with the mechanisms here, and why I think it's relatively unique. And why I think that's an important thing to try to understand. Because there's this really great review paper from 2014 about the attentional bias literature, and it surveys a number of different tasks that include the dot probe and emotional versions of the attentional blink and the emotional stroop and emotional forms of what we call visual search tasks. But there's this one line that really stood out to me, where they suggested that another notable psychometric weakness of the attentional bias measures is their low degree of convergent validity. They're all assumed to measure the same theoretical construct. So in other words, there's this fundamental kind of understanding or misunderstanding out there in the literature that all these different attention mechanisms, all these different attention tasks may tap into this, are different ways of tapping into the same thing. What I would suggest is that that's not necessarily the case, and that we can actually gain a lot of mileage for trying to understand and pull apart the roles that emotion plays in these different aspects of attention. It's also got some, if we're able to do so, if we're able to do something like that, I think it also has some implications for the intervention area, the psychological intervention area. One of the reasons people are so excited about this concept of attentional biases is because of this idea that, well, if it's true that anxiety and depression are exacerbated by these attentional biases, maybe we can help counter it, help treat anxiety and depression by training people to turn attention away from this threatening stimuli. But of course, this whole area of the literature has been based on things like the dot probe. Maybe one of the reasons, and it's a noisy literature at that, the results are extremely inconsistent about whether this is effective or not effective. And so maybe one of the reasons why it's such a noisy literature is because people aren't trying to disentangle or trying to specify what aspect of attention they're talking about. Or maybe they're just looking at the wrong aspect of attention in general. So like I said, the visual cognition literature, although it rarely strays outside of itself and tries to understand individual differences or at a clinical level, it does give us a tool to try to understand different aspects of attention. For those of you who may come from a visual cognition background, you may have already noticed that this emotion-induced blindness task is very similar and evocative of what you would call the attentional blink. In the attentional blink, what happens is you have a rapid serial visual presentation of items, and you often have to report two items in the stream. So you have to report what that white letter is, and then you have to say whether there was an X present or not. And people are bad at reporting that second target if it comes too close in time to the first target. It's thought to be a bottleneck, a limitation, how much information you're able to solidify in visual working memory before that information sort of fades or is overwritten. And so our initial assumption was that this, although you're only looking for one target in emotion-induced blindness, that's really just a spontaneous form of the attentional blink. But as we collect more data, my personal conviction is that it's actually, not only is emotion-induced blindness different from the dot probe and other spatial attention tasks like that, it's actually distinct from the attentional blink. What I think is actually going on with emotion-induced blindness is not that this, it has to do problems stabilizing that target representation in visual working memory, like people have often said the attentional blink is, but it reflects an earlier kind of perceptual competition between the target and the emotional distractor. And I'll just walk you through some of the key pieces of evidence that have convinced me of that, at least for the time being. So first, what I think actually is going on, just as this little schematic, is that rather than shifting attention back and forth between two locations, what may happen is that if you present these stimuli quickly enough in the same place, they give rise to a competition, sort of jostling for representational space in our visual system. And because of our tendency to prioritize emotional information, it's that highly salient emotional information that wins out at the cost, at the expense of seeing that target that comes afterwards. It's consistent with an idea that Kaisers and Parrott laid out in 2002 in this great Tix article, where they pointed out that when the sensory input to the brain activates two populations of neurons that represent different objects at the same place and time, the competition between those two incompatible representations ensures that at any given time, a single representation quickly wins. In other words, the brain can handle two different objects that appear at the same time at two different places, because that's a physical possibility. It can handle two objects that appear at the same place as long as they appear at two different times, but if they overlap in both time and space, then only one of these representations is going to win. And you may already notice, well, that's not exactly what's going on with emotion-induced blindness. They're appearing in the same place, but they are presented serially, so they're not exactly at the same time. Well, that's true as far as the stimuli go, but you might think about the fact that those neural representations are time locked. Those stimuli do have a temporal rise and fall, so those neural activations themselves overlap in time. One piece of evidence that seems to suggest that there's this competitive trade-off in how we allocate resources to a target versus that emotional distractor comes from an ERP study that my former PhD student, Brianna Kennedy, did. She's now a postdoc with Mara Mather in California. And what she found, she looked at some ERP components that were time-locked to both the distractor and to the target. And this is an N2, posterior N2 component. And this is time-locked to the distractor. Okay, so this is a case right here where that's actually just a baseline condition. That's a placeholder in the position of a distractor. So it's just an upright scene like all the other items in the stream. And so you can get this very small N2 activation. But when you have a neutral distractor that stands out because it's categorically distinctive in the stream, well then it gets a little bit larger. But it gets really, really big when it's an emotional distractor that's there. And if you take a look at that same component, time locked to the immediately subsequent target, you find that it's completely converted. And so what that suggests to me is it's not that there's this emotional distractor that appears and it just short circuits your perceptual processing, just fly out, but it takes away some of those processing resources that otherwise might have been devoted to the target. It's this competitive trade-off of perceptual processing resources that are allocated to the distractor versus the target. There's also, in terms of the behavioral work, an interesting finding that we had. One of the nicknames that we gave to this phenomenon originally was attentional rubbernecking, because our intuition was that what was going on was that you're looking through the stream, the scrolling by things are flashing by very fast, you're looking for the target, but then there's an emotional image, and even though that emotional image comes and goes, you just can't disengage from it. It's like you're rubbernecking when you pass a car accident scene. But that explanation comes with a very testable prediction. It suggests that if that's what's going on, then that emotional distraction should impair your ability to see a target that comes afterwards, but it shouldn't impair your ability to see a target that comes beforehand. All right, so we put that to the test. When the target came afterwards, we got very robust emotion-induced blindness once again. And the question is, what happens now when the target comes first? It comes 100 milliseconds before the distractor does. So your perceptual system, which works very, very fast, has had 100 milliseconds to process that target, but then it gets hit with an emotional distractor, and you get the same basic effect. And in fact, if you take this difference right here for each person, and that difference right there for each person, and they correlate with each other, which I'd say indirectly suggests, it's suggestive, it's not conclusive, but it suggests that what's going on here might be basically the same mechanism as what's going on there. Perhaps this sort of competition between these perceptual representations, again, with our spontaneous tendency to prioritize emotional information, just causing that representation to win out at the expense of our ability to see the target before. So it's got a bidirectional effect, which, by the way, you don't really get in the attentional blink. So that's another piece of evidence suggesting that what's going on here is different from the attentional blink. But I'd say that, to me, one of the most compelling findings that we had to suggest what's going on is a relatively early perceptual competition mechanism came from work by another former PhD student of mine, Ling Wang. And this was an experiment that we ran in a year when nothing was working. I don't know if you're familiar with this feeling, but sometimes when you run experiment after experiment, you don't actually get something that you can report. And this happened to us throughout the course of a year. And so finally at the end of the year, I was like, Ling, how about this? Let's just do a no-brainer experiment. We know what's going to happen, but at least it'll give us something to report and get our morale up for the next year. Let's have a dual-stream version of the task going, where people have to monitor 2 streams at a time for the target, and have it so that that emotional distractor could either appear in the same stream as the target, or in the opposite stream as the target. I know it's not interesting. We know what's going to happen because this is like the attentional blink. It's just going to be competition for consolidation of the working memory, so it shouldn't matter whether they appear in the same stream or not. But let's just do it. So when they appeared in the same stream as each other, you got robust emotion-induced blindness. But what really surprised me is that when they appeared in the opposite stream from each other, you really didn't get much of an effect at all. And in other follow-ups that we did, you didn't even get that trend in that direction. It's a significant two-way interaction. So the degree to which that emotional distractor impairs your ability to see a target is much, much stronger when the target appears in that same spatial location as the distractor than when it appears in a different location. Now, it's not due to people fixating one of these streams versus another. That certainly would have been a possibility. It was one that one of my colleagues at Delaware raised. So maybe it's just because they're looking at one stream and not the other. I was like, oh, that's so parsimonious it hurts. I'll get to that when I can. And then I got to UNSW, and one of my colleagues said, well, maybe it's because of where they're looking. And I said, okay, that really hurts. Let's put this to the test. What we did is we ran what we call a gaze-contingent eye tracking study, where we monitored which of those streams people were looking at in real time. And when they were looking, let's say, at the top stream, that meant half the time we placed that distractor in the location where they were looking, and half the time we placed that distractor in the opposite location. So that we had this really nicely controlled balance design where we could analyze the data that way. Well, this is what happened. When the distractor appeared where they were looking, you got spatially localized effect. It's there but not there. Again, it's even two-way interaction. But when it appeared at the opposite location from where they're looking, again, you got where when they overlap in space, but not when they appeared at the opposite location. So this suggests that it's not a function of which of these streams you are looking at, which I was very pleased by. Now here's the neat finding, and I'll tell you why I'm excited by this, how it taps into other theories out there in the literature. So in a follow-up experiment, what she did was she didn't make this emotional distractor always task irrelevant. She told people that at the end of the experiment that they're going to get a memory test for these distractors, and that made these distractors all of a sudden task relevant. Well, what happened there? Again, you got more robust emotion-induced blindness when this target distractor created the same stream than the opposite location, regardless of where they're fixating. But now you start to get a significant difference in that opposite location as well, right? So this impairment starts to spread across the two streams. And the reason I'm really excited about that is because it really dovetails nicely with this computational model that a friend of mine, Brad Weigel, has put together about multiple sources of interference in these types of rapid serial visual presentation tasks. And his model suggests that there are many places where you can get interference. You get interference at this early input level, where things compete in a spatially temporally driven competition type of mechanism way. But leaving part B aside, because I don't know how that fits in yet, when you encode something into working memory, what you get is suppression across the visual field, represented by that whole node there, so that things anywhere in the visual field now start to be suppressed. Right? Do you see how that fits in there? So what might be going on is that the emotion-induced blindness that we see when the distractions are task irrelevant reflects this kind of competition right here, that spatial temporally driven kind of competition. You start adding these memory demands, and now you start that impairment starts to spread across the visual field. And I think what might be going on in terms of the relationship between emotion-induced blindness and the attentional blink is that attentional blink, remember, you always have to report the two targets in the attentional blink. So the first target is always task relevant, you have to put it into working memory. And it turns out the attentional blink does seem to spread across the visual field. Whereas emotion-induced blindness, whereas the impairment arises even though that distractor is task irrelevant, is spatially localized. So mapping what our findings onto Brad Weigel's model, I think seems to really give us some power to start to look at different information processing mechanisms, different information processing bottlenecks that are differentially impacted by emotional distractors. So that's part of my talk where I sort of lay out my understanding of what I think is going on with the mechanisms involved in emotion-induced blindness. But let's say that you're not a cognitive psychologist and that's not where your passion lies. You want to understand how we can use measures to understand individual differences. Well, then the question comes, well, okay, so people are so sensitive to emotional distractors that imperatively they see the one target that they're looking for. Does this correlate with individual differences? And we do have some evidence to suggest that it does. So this is a study that we published in 2010. It was with my University of Delaware colleague, J.P. Lorenzo. And it's one of these cases, you may have cases like this in your own research lives, where it's just, we got along so well that we were like, we've got to do a study together. I don't know what we're going to do, but we've got to find a way to work together. And being able to find a way to work together was made even more difficult by the fact that while I study sort of attention mechanisms, he studies romantic relationships. How do we find that bridge? And so we came to this realization that, well, when it comes to the way we experience emotions in our lives, there's no context in which we experience it more powerfully than in our social attachments, and in particularly in our romantic relationships. And let's see if we can capitalize on that. And so we brought a subset of these couples into my lab, And it was all heterosexual couples in this case. And we sat them down at computers that were in the same room, kind of next to each other, with a curtain drawn between them. And an experimenter came in and said, okay, here's what we need you to do. Female partner, we need you to look at these rapid sequences of images and find the target. And basically the emotion-induced blindness task. And that's what they did. Then the experimenter turned towards the male partner and said, okay, what we need you to do is you're just going to see pictures of landscapes one at a time. Just rate how attractive you find these landscapes on a scale of 1 to 9. Go. And so they did this for about 10 minutes. And then the experimenter came back into the room and she turned to the female partner and she said, we need more data from you, just keep doing what you're doing. And she turned to the male partner and said, okay, you're going to do something a little different now. Now instead of rating how attractive you find these landscapes, you're going to see pictures of single women who are on campus here. Rate how attractive you find them. Of course, this was all in earshot of the partner. And at the end of the experiment, the female partner's computer sort of prompted her and said, okay, now in all fairness, how uncomfortable were you with the possibility that your partner was rating the attractiveness of other women on campus? Now, the truth is, none of these were women on campus. They were just pictures drawn from the internet. But it was our cover story. And it was neat, too. We got a, you might think that they just laughed us off. We got a nice distribution. Some women said, they laughed off. He's going to be in trouble when he gets home. And then other women were a little, he's going to be in trouble when he gets home. More serious about it. And so we got this nice distribution of discomfort levels. We see here, that's not me, but so here on the x-axis you get the level of discomfort that they reported about this situation. And on the y-axis you get the amount of emotion-induced blindness they experienced. And so we found was that the more discomfort they reported, the more they experienced emotion-induced blindness. I was struck by this. I said this is the most beautiful, spurious finding I've ever seen. So we ran it again, because I really was like, you know, it's one of these cases where you wish you didn't have to run a second experiment, but I really didn't believe it. So we ran it again, and got almost the exact same correlation, the same R value. But what also made it particularly neat was if you did a median split in terms of whether they reported a high level of discomfort or low level of discomfort, here's what we found. Those two groups of women did not differ in their accuracy following a neutral distractor. They didn't differ in their accuracy in a baseline condition where there was no distractor. They specifically differed following an emotionally negative distractor. But what also made this particularly neat, because you might say, okay, that's cool. But maybe it's just that those women who happen to be more reactive to the emotional stimuli are those women who are going to feel less comfortable in that kind of situation. But if you went back and you took a look at this correlation at the time that their partner was rating the attractiveness of the landscapes, it wasn't there. It was specific to that period of time when their partner was rating the attractiveness of other women. So it seems to be sensitive to state fluctuations in emotion. And we've had some success, and other labs have had some success, finding links with individual differences as well. So in 2015, we published a report finding that it predicted individual differences in rumination and brooding. In a paper, actually it's now published, not in press, we found, with our colleague Howard Barenbaum in Illinois, found that it predicted differences in your ability to stop worrying. Not in how much you started worrying, but your ability to stop worrying once you had started worrying. Which is particularly interesting because this is an inability to sort of let go of that worrying thought, and in the emotion-induced blindness task, it's an inability to disengage, to stop processing that emotional image, even though it's already come and gone. So there's sensitive to that. In a paper that we have in revision with my colleague Eva Kamanis right now, we found the reverse. So the people who scored high in levels in trait psychopathy showed less emotion-induced blindness. And in a paper that we have under review right now, we found people who played a lot of violent video games showed less emotion-induced blindness as well. And then other labs, in a more sort of content-specific type of way, also found that it predicted differences in PTSD, hunger and restrained eating, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So, I mean, I do have to say that, you know, we also have instances where we've not found links with individual differences, just like any other measure. But there have been enough of these links that's convinced me that there is some degree to which state fluctuations in state emotion and individual differences can be predicted by this emotion-induced blindness measure. Now, I'm going to walk you through a recent paper from last year from my PhD student, Sandy Oni, where I think we really made this point about the importance of dissociating between attention mechanisms very explicit. What we did is we said, okay, we've been saying all this time that spatial attention measures like the dot probe tap into a different attention mechanism than emotion-induced blindness does. So let's see what we can do with this. And so we recruited people into our lab, and we gave them both the dot probe and the emotion-induced blindness task. And we made sure that both tasks were equated in certain ways. We made sure that the negative and the neutral stimuli that we used in both tasks were the same. And we also used the same stimulus onset asynchronies. So in the dot probe task, we used an SOA of 100 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds, which is pretty standard in the dot probe literature. And so in the emotion-induced blindness task, we used a lag of 1 for 100 milliseconds and 5, so 500 milliseconds. So those SOAs were equated. So people came in and they filled out a few questionnaires that clustered onto 2 different factors. We gave them the DAS-21, measures depression, anxiety, and stress, which all clustered onto what we call negative affect. And we gave them the Penn State Worry Questionnaire and the Ruminative Response Scales. It's basically tendency to just, perseverate on negative thoughts. And that sort of clustered onto another factor called persistent negative thought. And then we gave them both the dot probe and the emotion-induced blindness task in counterbalanced order. We did it. Now, I'll say that although we tested both the 100 millisecond lags in both cases and the 500 millisecond lags in both cases, at no point did we find anything interesting in the 500 millisecond SOA cases. So everything I'm going to show you came from that 100 millisecond SOA. So, first of all, consistent with the idea that they tapped into different mechanisms, the 2 tasks did not predict each other one bit. There was no correlation between people's performance on the dot probe and with emotion-induced blindness. So it suggests that maybe there really are different mechanisms. Then we took a look at how they accounted for variability in the negative affect and persistent negative thought. We found that both in a regression predicted negative affect. Emotion-induced blindness did a little bit better job, but they both predicted it. But they accounted for unique variance in negative affect. So 2 different attention mechanisms that both independently link up with negative affect. When it came to whether they predicted persistent negative thought, only emotion-induced blindness did that. And using a mediation analysis, we found that the link between emotion-induced blindness and negative affect was really driven by its relationship with persistent negative thought. So again, that's more evidence suggesting that these 2 attention mechanisms are connecting, are linking up with clinically relevant individual differences through 2 different paths, 2 different mechanisms, 2 different consequences for perception and attention. And that mediation was not there for the dot probe. Well, here's one of the money questions. For those of you who know the dot probe literature, I mean, it's been proven to be fantastically useful in some cases and not so useful in other cases. But one of the most problematic issues that have come up in relation to the dot probe is that it's really got poor test-retest reliability, or at least questionable test-retest reliability, which is a problem when you're trying to use it to make links with what you would call trait-like individual differences. How can we trust these correlations with individual differences when the test doesn't even correlate with itself, right? And there's been a number of papers that have shown that the test reliability of the dot probe is not that great. And so we decided to put the emotion-induced blindness measure to this task. We had to do the emotion-induced blindness task 2 times a week apart, and found that when you looked at performance following negative distractors, controlling for neutral distractors, you got test reliability coefficients about 0.44, 0.42, and depending on what lag you look at. I mean, that's good in the context of the broader attention motion literature. That's not bad. But if you take a look at negative trials alone, that test reliability goes up to 0.72 and basically 0.8, which is now we're talking. And I forgot to mention, and this is important, that back at these graphs right here, those relationships with negative affect and with persistent negative thought, those held up regardless of whether you were controlling for performance following a neutral distractor or whether you weren't. And so that made me even more excited by the fact that we got this kind of test reliability in a measure that seemed to link up with those kinds of individual differences. Now, I will say, I am very excited about this, but this is we've only done one test-retest reliability examination of motion-induced blindness. The dot probe has been subject to test after test after test, and so I'd like to see this replicated. I'm cautiously excited. Next time someone tells me that they're going to do test reliability of the motion-induced blindness test, I'll just hold my breath until I hear what the outcome is. Okay, I think this is the last overarching point that I'll get into, is to what degree are we able to overcome emotion-induced blindness? I mean, I think like this not only has some, to me, I see theoretical, it's interesting to me theoretically. It has interest value, I think, clinically, because of the way it links up with clinically relevant individual differences. But if those emotional images out there are blinding you to things that are right in front of you, then it's also got practical implications. Think about the degree to which advertisers on the roadway try to engage your interest by putting up emotionally evocative images. You know, if we're in that situation, can we overcome emotion-induced blindness in the service of our own safety? So can we impose attentional control over it? Now, there's a couple different ways you can think about attentional control, though. In the attention literature, people can impose top-down attentional control over the ability to see target by adopting what you might call a target template, forming an image in their mind of what it is that they're looking for, and that's going to increase the efficiency of their visual search if they search for the target. But there's also a suggestion that people can form a rejection template, that form in their mind what they're trying to ignore, and trying to apply that. So there's 2 different ways to apply attentional control in the service of trying to overcome emotion-induced blindness. And it turns out that they seem to have different levels of effectiveness. So in that target template idea, the idea of adopting attentional control, targeting the target, here's the manipulation that we did. And this is an experiment where we had 2 types of blocks. In one type of block, people were told that their target would be sometimes a rotated landscape with no building in it. In other cases, that rotated target would have a building in it. We call that the non-specific attentional set condition. They have an idea of what they're looking for, but it's not a terribly, terribly concrete idea. And in other blocks, we told them that now your target's always going to have a rotated house. It gives you an opportunity to develop a stronger, more concrete target template. Now, of course, we only looked at trials that had the houses in it, just to remove any kind of role that the featural differences would have, because some of the targets only had a landscape in it. Now, this actually might seem like a relatively, not the most intuitive measure of attentional control, but it does have, so you can observe its effects in the brain. So for example, in a follow-up experiment the following year, we gave people this, manipulation in an fMRI scanner. And this is what's more highly active when people have that specific attentional set, when they're able to form a more concrete template in their mind for what they're looking for, than when it's a less concrete, a non-specific attentional set. And you can see that you get greater activity in several classically control-related areas, like the frontal gyri and the inferior parietal lobe. But you'll see really, really robustly more activation in occipital temporal areas, which has been indicated in things like mental imagery and perception. So just the strategy of forming a more concrete target template in your mind, despite no differences in what's in front of you, leads to greater activation in mental imagery-related areas. Does this affect our ability to overcome emotion-induced blindness? Turns out that it kind of depends on who you are. Because we also gave people a measure of what's called harm avoidance, which has been, so it's basically how much you try to avoid dangerous situations. It's loosely associated with trait anxiety. So people scored low in harm avoidance or high in harm avoidance. And when people had a non-specific attentional set, that is, they didn't know exactly what it was that they were looking for, you got a lot of emotion-induced blindness, regardless of whether you were high in harm avoidance or low in harm avoidance. The question is, what happens now when you give people this specific attentional set, this ability to form a target template to increase your effectiveness, your ability to find a target? Well, if you were high in harm avoidance, you still got emotion-induced blindness. It did seem to improve your ability to ignore the neutral distractors, but you've got that big difference there. You can't get rid of emotion-induced blindness. But if you scored low in harm avoidance, the effect is completely away. So it seems like these individual differences that are linked up with things like anxiety or harm avoidance also come with greater ability to apply executive control in the service of your goal of finding that target. So what about forming more of a template for rejection? So now you're trying to brace yourself against emotional distraction. You're driving down that highway, and you know you're going to come across these powerful billboards. Can you brace yourself against it in a way to avoid emotion-induced blindness? Well, there, it seems to be much less effective. And I won't walk you through all the findings, but we've done things like we've proactively warned people that in this block of trials, you're always going to get an emotional distractor if you brace yourself. And we did get a little bit of an improvement. People were able to slightly do a slightly better job at seeing the target. But I had a visiting graduate student in my lab this past year who ran a direct extension of that and wasn't able to replicate it. So I'd say that in some we have a minimal effect of that strategy. We gave people up to $90 to ignore the emotional distractors. We said, you're going to do a better job seeing your target if you can ignore these emotional distractors. And if you get up above this threshold, we'll give you $90. And we did. And it had minimal effect. It slightly improved performance following an emotionally negative distractor, but absolutely no, that's why we also included erotic distractors. Absolutely no improvement following the erotic distractors. Which either, I suppose, means that there's something more fundamentally hardwired about our tendency to pay attention to erotic distractors, or it means that when you're testing a university-age crowd, there's no amount of money that you pay them because of emotional distractors. Either way, it's kind of interesting implications there. In a paper that came out this year, we gave people blocks where they had a high proportion of trials with negative distractors, and blocks where they had a low proportion, and we told them this explicitly. In other types of attention tasks, this has been shown to reduce interference, even in something as robust as a Stroop effect, but made absolutely no difference in emotional blindness. Having a whole bunch of trials that contain emotional distractors didn't reduce the degree to which you experienced it at all. We manipulated how categorically distinctive the distractor was in the context of the stream by changing the homogeneity or the heterogeneity of the other items in the stream. And that did have an effect on your ability, the degree to which you were distracted by the neutral distractors, but it had no effect on how much you were distracted by the emotional distractors. And we've also had people reappraise the emotional distractors. Say, imagine these are all sort of, this is makeup, and these are sort of stills from a movie scene. And again, no effect at all. So when it comes to forming a strategy to exert attentional control over emotion-induced blindness, it seems we're very, very poor at bracing ourselves against emotional distraction. So this idea that emotion-induced blindness is not so terribly subject or open to the influence of attentional control, I think again, at least to some level, at least to my mind, again, is consistent with this idea that it involves this sort of relatively early, low-level perceptual competition between the target and the emotional distractor. So to me, at least, the evidence seems to be telling a relatively coherent story until someone comes around and punctures it. But so far that hasn't happened. So to me, it's a sort of internally consistent story so far. So to start to wrap up, like I said, as long as you're using stimuli that are emotional enough, we never don't get the effect. It's a very robust effect. And I think, and I hope I have made some sense and convinced some of you that I think it does reflect a relatively unique mechanism that's out there in the context of all the other attention emotion paradigms that are out there in the literature. It does seem to reflect a relatively early perceptual competition between the distractor and target. And it can be used to look at individual differences. Now we're trying to titrate, we're trying to figure out how can we make the best recommendations for, so people can increase their ability to find individual differences. If you can imagine that if all the images that we're using are too intense, then we're going to get ceiling effects that will wipe out individual differences. You can imagine it also depends on what task, what lag we're using. So we're playing around with that, trying to figure out what is going to give us the best combination of variability between people and test reliability. But we're working on it. And it does seem to be resistant to attentional control. And I think, again, to my mind, I think one of the reasons that I've been so engrossed with this research endeavor for the last 13 years is because I think it really showcases the exciting potential to bring areas together. To bring the insights that we get about attention from the visual cognition area and use it in a useful way to try to understand clinically relevant individual differences. It might inform a more fine-tuned attentional bias modification strategy. So these are all things that we're trying to explore. So it's got implications both for our understanding of visual processing, our understanding of clinically relevant individual differences, and I'd say that potentially it has implications for the way we perceive reality in real life. I mean, when it comes to things like eyewitness testimony, we know, and we've proven, that people will remember things differently. And this has informed the way eyewitnesses are questioned and interviewed. It's one of these areas where psychology has really had a measurable and important impact on the real world and on policy. But I think that, based on what I've seen from the work I've been doing so far, it's possible that when we come to an emotional scene, it's not just that we might remember them differently, but that each of us might literally see it differently. So thank you very much. It's a real honor being here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, the question, does it need to be like a negative distractor? For example, and does it matter the type of negative? For example, can it also just be like because you showed this kind of threatening stimuli, like for example, you showed here this threatening negative stimuli, but can also, for example, be like a disgusting negative stimuli, emotional. Can it be like a positive stimuli, for example, like babies or sex or something? Can it also be other type of stimuli that are not emotional, maybe like pop-outs, for example? Let's say if you just show green and then maybe like a red type of distractor.
Yeah.
And related to that question, let's say if this also works for positive, do you then get opposite effects with some of these individual differences? For example, in negative, then it's more correlated with anxiety, but let's say with positive, it's kind of the other way around.
Yeah. That was a series of really, every one of those questions was really good. So let's start with, so first of all, in terms of the discuss image, most of the images that we use are discuss images. The combination, it's hard to say how much is a burn victim, the picture of a burn victim, how much is that a threat image versus a discuss image. So we haven't really gone down that road of trying to separate out these discrete types of emotion categories yet. The next question.
So it was positive and...
Okay, so here's no, it does work with positive stimuli, but there is this, if you take a look at the literature, there's this asymmetry that's just there in the literature writ large. It's that negative images or negative stimuli tend to capture attention more than positive ones do. And this has informed some pretty influential theories suggesting that we have something like a pre-attentive threat detection mechanism and stuff like that. But here's the problem, is that when you use these negative images, these negative stimuli tend to also be more arousing, more intense. You look at a picture of a baby or a puppy dog, and it induces like a positive feeling, but it's pretty like a sort of a calming kind of emotional experience. One of the only classes of stimuli that tends to be rated both as positive and as emotionally intense as the negative ones are erotic stimuli. And that's why we use that. And in that case, we get a very, very robust effect.
So sorry, actually, we're just at the hour mark, and so I recommend that we ask our questions with wine in hand and issues in the other hand. But if everyone can just join me in thanking Steve for a great talk.